been asked to introduce this afternoon's speaker, Alan Gray, because I've known him for many, many more years than either of us would care to remember. He's a journalist in the technology field. I did get into terrible trouble introducing him once as a technical journalist, not that technical. Anyway, he's worked in all sorts of areas, including being news editor of computing at one point in his career. And also, if you remember my piece of self-advertising, his name appeared next to mine on the end of the telly programme we made for Channel 4. Well, we didn't make it, we just thought of it. But he spent a long time observing the computing and communications industry, latterly being editor-at-large of a magazine in the Telecoms capacity magazine in the Telecoms industry. And he's now, as he was telling us, taking a year off while he thinks of new projects. So we nailed him for this eventually, after a couple of tries for various reasons. And I'd like to ask him to present South London's role in the history of telecoms.
Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, rid of the problem.
Yes, please. Yeah.
Zoom.
Thank you very much indeed. Thanks, Dan, for that introduction, and welcome to all of you in the room and all of you remotely. Don't you just love Zoom? Where would we have been without it? So, I'm, as Dan says, Alan Gray. I spent 50 years. I became a journalist 50 years ago, having done a degree in physics and electronics at Leeds. Decided I was better at writing about it than doing it. I'm not going to talk about computers in this talk, except for one brief reference, quite historical, but I hope you'll appreciate it. My first job was in Woolwich, and so for 50 years I've lived in southeast London, got to know the area and what lives along the riverside in Greenwich and Woolwich and North Woolwich and further down river, but I won't go that. So we've planned the technology. I'm going to be talking about particularly this area of southeast London along the river. You see the dome there at the top of the north end of Greenwich Peninsula. You see the docks and the city airport in the centre, top centre, and you see Greenwich Park in the southwestern corner, and that goes on to Blackheath, which is where I live, because I've just been in southeast London for half a century. And all those dots really are where the international telecommunications industry started. Places like, well, the red dots are the factories, where the factories were. Just south of the dome is Telcom, which I'm going to focus on. On the north side of the river is North Woolwich, where there are a number of factories, STC and other people, Henley. Just by the barrier, west of that is Siemens Brothers, now being rebuilt into flats or revived into flats and workshops and things like that. The green spot is Woolwich Poly, which is now rather fancier at Greenwich University in the old Royal Naval College. But that plays a significant part in southeast London's role in telecoms in more ways than one. The orange spot on the far western edge is where the Great Eastern Paddle steamer was built, and that's absolutely vital to the story I'm telling. They're all places that have contributed to southeast London's unrivaled role in building what we now call the connected world, keeping the world connected. It goes down river a bit towards Erith, but there were lots of places like that. Of course, the cable industry, the telecoms cable industry, started for very good reason along the river because they had river access, but of course they had experience in building cables for the shipping industry, all the way along there. And if you look at an old survey map in the late 19th century, you'll see cable walks, which were very long things. There's one at Chatham Dockyard still, where they built cables, or hemp, or whatever materials they were building them. And of course, that experience transferred directly into the telecoms industry. They didn't, of course, that day carry phone calls. Phones arrived much later. This is Alexander Graham Bell in 1876, at the centenary of the US Declaration of Independence. By then, the world controlled by European countries in the US, what used to be called the Great Powers. I was intrigued to see that this week's issue of New Statesman used the Great Powers on its front cover, meaning, of course, the big powers today. But great powers used to be France and Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Britain and the US. They were interconnected by the electric telegraph from the 1850s and 60s onwards. What my friend on Standage memorably calls the Victorian internet. He's a Greenwichite as well, and is currently on the senior staff member of The Economist. These electric wires carried telegrams, and they were the seed of international networks and what is now the global internet. You don't need me probably to tell you what a telegram is. I did a version of this to a younger audience at one stage, and I had to explain what a telegram was. I have some telegrams from my father as he was coming home from the war. So they're about 46 or 47. But these days, people don't know what they are. Anyway, it's also, sadly, a tale of industrial dereliction. Being the centre of the high-tech industry of telecoms in the 1850s for 100 years or more, there isn't a single research and development site or factory in the whole of London. With one small example here, in Greenwich. That's North Woolwich. It's called the Henley Arms because there was Henley, a cable maker based there, but this was a year or so ago. It's just a wreck now. London was also home to the first commercial telecoms operators. The Electric Telegraph Company, the National Telephone Company, the General Post Office, of course, which took over the country's telegraph network, and then the telephone network. And there was, as well as some international telegraph operators. It's a sort of mixed market, as it is today, indeed. In those days, there were national telegraph and telephone operators, and there were a separate bunch of companies that ran the international network. And that's exactly the same as it was from the 19th century. You had the post office, running the telegraph system here, but you had independent companies, usually commercial companies, running international networks. This is my mention of computing, of course. This is that blue plaque went up only a few weeks ago. I went around earlier this year, look at that place at the Post Office Research Centre in Dollis Hill. They moved out to Suffolk 40 odd years ago, and I was really sad to see that there was no sign of what the place had been. Why it was there. It's just turned into a gated community. It is literally a gated community. You can't drive in through the gate without pressing a button, talk to somebody and say who you are. But fortunately, a few weeks ago, finally, English Heritage put that blue plaque up on the wall there. You don't get close in to see it, I don't think. I haven't been back. It's a long walk up from Dollis Hill Station. It's a long climb up the hill. But there are other places, GC's Hertz Research Centre, which developed commercialised or industrialised the magnetrons that were developed in the Second World War at Royal University, Pi TMC in West Dulwich, as well as Dollis Hill. And Tommy Flowers, of course, was born in Poplar, also trained at Woolwich Poly, and designed, as you know, only too well. He worked with Turing and others at Bletchley to build the first computer here at Dollis Hill. But let's start here, away from North London to South East London, along the Greenwich Riverside, and this is Enderby House. It was the head office of a company called Telegraph Construction and Maintenance, usually abbreviated to Telcom. It was the biggest maker of submarine telegraph cables in the world, connecting the world's people from 1850 onwards. In fact, in the first century, I've got the centenary book that he published in 1950, which was just before I was born. It made 82% of the world's subsea cables in that first 100 years. That's what it looked like 70 years ago when it was, or 73 years ago when it was celebrating its centenary. And then this is the state it was in 40 years ago. Sorry, not 40 years ago, 10 years ago, when the successor to Telcom, that's Alcatel Submarine Networks, had sold off most of the land for development. It decided it moved the cable production to firstly Southampton, then Calais, sold off the rest of the land for development, including Enderby House, that building there. And as you see, it was virtually unprotected. And so Dan and I and about 10 other troublemakers got together, people in southeast London, people in the submarine cable industry, people who worked in that building itself, but also local history people, industrial history people, got together and caused trouble and embarrassed the developers by showing that picture. Remember what happened in Birmingham a few weeks ago, or in the West Midlands rather, near Wolverhampton a few weeks ago. That could have been pulled down by some young lads on a Friday night. My wife used to be properties correspondent for the Financial Times, and said it's quite familiar that thing. If developers wanted they had a listed building. This is listed grade 2. But if they wanted a listed building that was in the way, they would just leave it like that, and somehow magically it would get burned down on a Friday night, and by the time they all came home, came back on a Monday, it would be irreparable, and so there would be no option but to demolish it. This is also at the height, this is early 80s, before Alcatel or STC as it would have been then started to run it down. That picture on the left is the big factory. The cable came straight out of the factory onto that loading gear, which is still there. It's the only real survivor. Onto a cable ship, and that was a cable ship, a disused cable ship that had been moored there for years, John W. Mackay, and eventually got scrapped in the 80s. And that's a better view as well. That white building is Enderby House. The offices are on the left, and the factory is on the right. Lots of winding gear, lots of loading gear there. So, but let me show you what it looks like now after Dan and I and other people fought to save it and embarrass the people. It's that. It's a thriving pub. It's a riverside pub called Enderby House. It doesn't really pay much acknowledgement to its history. It's been extended to the back, but that concrete thing at the front right, there are 3 structures there. They are supposed to be diagrams in concrete of submarine cables. So they're showing the core. There's one at the right at the back, shows the single copper strand with some reinforcement around it. One of the nearer ones is supposed to show different optical fibres. With no explanation what it's about. It's just somewhere to sit and have your drink. That's me. This is me when I started out on the left. And I say I was a journalist. I've been covering the telecoms industry and the electronics industry and the computing industry for 50 years. I'm just taking a pause. But why did it happen here? It happened because the UK and London in particular had the scientists and the engineers and the capital investments. It was like a Silicon Valley of the 1850s and 60s. It had all the financial and scientific and technological resource, and it had the least need because of politics, because it was the heart of an empire. It was an imperial city, I suppose you could say. It had the military need. Some of the first cables were in the 1860s went to India and through the Red Sea to control, to communicate with parts of the British Empire as it was, and to communicate with British possessions through the Mediterranean, Gibraltar and Malta. Still routes that are today used by subsea cables. I'm going to show you some of the effects of telecommunications, particularly in the delivery of information. And it's something that most people don't really quite appreciate it. We're all used, certainly over the last 3 or 4 years, to the fact that you can do Zoom calls across the world, you can WhatsApp somebody in California or in Australia or in India, and they will get the message within a few seconds. It's something that has changed really quickly. Certainly in my lifetime, booking a call to a European country was an elaborate process, and you had to book. You could get 3 minutes, and you had to book it a couple of days ahead. And of course, now it's just changed. It doesn't matter where somebody is. Now, that picture is the death of Nelson on the Victory on the 21st of October, 1805. It was a naval battle, as you know, off the southwest coast of Spain. The Admiralty and the rest of the country didn't get to hear about it and the battle or Nelson's death until the 6th of November. That was 2.5 weeks later. This is another. This is a decade later, almost, 1815, Battle of Waterloo, just outside Brussels on the 18th of June, 1815. The first news reached the Minister of War in London on the evening of the 21st of June. That's 3 days after the battle, after Britain and Prussia defeated Napoleon and he was captured. And it was reported here on the 22nd of June, 4 days after the battle. And now, of course, you can physically travel between London and Brussels in 2 hours, and the internet time for communications between London and Brussels is about 3 milliseconds. But that was just the London. Let's look at carrying the news. This is a map produced by Dan Bogart, Associate Professor of Economics at the University of California in Irvine. He's worked out the travel time between London and Manchester in 1700, so just over a century before what we're talking, was 90 hours. The fastest way of delivering news and information for almost all of human history was via a rider on a horse. By 1787, because of better roads, the turnpike roads, well-surfaced roads with tarmac macadam on which horses and carriages or stagecoaches could travel fast, shorten that speed from London to Manchester to 24 hours. Today it's 2 hours, if that is working well. I did it in 2 hours and back a few weeks ago. But then you had to spend a day going to Manchester. Got some sea in the way, and you're in trouble. As I showed you those figures about the battles of Trafalgar and Waterloo. It was even worse at the end of the American War of Independence, because you've got the whole Atlantic Ocean in the way. Britain and the US signed the Treaty of Paris. There you are. In Paris, obviously, on the 3rd of September 1783. Congress took until 4 months, until January 1784, to ratify the treaty, including all the travel time across the Atlantic. And the signed treaty that made the peace official didn't get to Paris until March. So it's 6 months between the Treaty of Paris and concluding the war to the knowledge of all participants. And of course, in that time, there were battles and people were killed because they thought they were still at war. Things took a long time. And of course, the Romans, before the electric telegraph, there were other ways to send information faster than the speed of a horse. The Romans used smoke and flames. This is a reconstruction of the signal station that they had at Scarborough on the Yorkshire coast. On the Saxon shore, that's what it would have looked like, but there are archaeological remains you can walk around and look at. That was to tell the Roman army that the Saxons were approaching across the horizon. And of course, 1300 years later, when the Armada was threatening, they had a chain of beacons, and the National Trust, which built this reproduction beacon, worked it out. It took 12 hours to send an alert from the south coast, York. That's 450 kilometres from Plymouth to York. That's 40 kilometres an hour. A bit faster than a horse, or a relay of horses, but it's still quite slow. Revolutionary France gave birth to a much richer visual system. More than just the Spanish raiders are coming, some prearranged message, or the Saxons have appeared over the horizon, but whole sentences using its sort of alphabet, communicated by these semaphore arms, which were operated via that rope and pulley mechanism by a couple of blokes sitting there in that shed with somebody else looking at through a telescope at the relay station next along the chain. This was Claude Chappe on the left. He built the network for Napoleon. Messages by line of sight. Hill stations with a set of rotating arms, as you see. There's a map. It covered the whole country, of course, based on Paris, as it is French, but going as far south as Nice, and going to the Spanish border, going to Brittany, and coming up to the Channel as well, and going east to Strasbourg and across into Switzerland. A British naval officer investigating after the Battle of Waterloo found it was possible to send a message from Paris to Strasbourg in 15 minutes. Cities are 1,400 kilometres apart, so that means the signal travelled at an average speed of 1,600 kilometres an hour. A lot faster than a dispatch rider on a horse, and also faster than the speed of sound. If you want more on it, Alexandre Dumas Père featured the semaphore system in his book Count of Monte Cristo, which he published in 1844. It's set in France after the Battle of Waterloo. The British Admiralty said, nah, first, we don't want anything like that, these funny foreign inventions. Just as much later, they said we've got enough telegraph boys. The post office said we've got enough telegraph boys, so why do we need the telephone system? In the 1790s, they finally relented and built a telegraph network, a semaphore with shutters, and you see in that picture, shutters that went up and down. It's hard to see, but the same process. Somebody sitting there looking through a telescope at the previous signal station. And there are lots of telegraph hills right across south of England, where these telegraph stations were originally set up. They started at the Admiralty. That's a building that was put up in the Edwardian era, so it's not the original. The evidence I've seen of those sketches, the original station was where that bunker, the ivy coloured bunker, covered bunker, was originally based. That thing sticking up isn't Nelson's column, but it's the Duke of York's column next to off the Mall. That went from there to West Square near the Elephant. And it went on a line to Deal, 10 intermediate stations. West Square, that is White Bow window, it was the house of the Director of Telegraphs for the Admiralty, and the original telegraph equipment was right on top of the building, where you see that flat roof extension. But that would have carried a whole structure. The next station along was in Nunhead, Ploughgarlick Hill it was called at the time, but then became Telegraph Hill Park, which is what it's known today. It would have been where the tennis court is now. And a great view over London, though we'll come back to that. The next one along, and I'm not going to go beyond here because there were lots of 10 stations all the way to Deal. This was Shooters Hill, very conveniently. Still a great place for radio communications equipment, mobile base station, and lots of other radio equipment up there on that mast. But of course, as you will recall, if you're my age, there was fog. And that's a Monet picture from the 19th century. But the fog lasted until the 1960s. Not very good for communications networks that require good visibility. And not very good at night at all. They weren't lit. Incidentally, the shutter telegraph didn't conduct news about the Battle of Trafalgar. That was carried by horse by a guy called Lieutenant John Lapierre, who had been the captain at the Battle of Trafalgar. And he managed to do it in 38 hours from Devon to London. And the line from Deal didn't carry the Waterloo message because the Admiralty had said, nothing to do with us. And they closed down their network by 1815. It wasn't a naval war anymore, so what did they care? Sorry for any Navy people here, but they did. So again, it was people on a horse. We went back to the original method of communicating, and that was it for just a few years until the physicists and scientists and electronic engineers in London developed the electric telegraph, and their work created the first telecoms revolution. And this was the main sort of it. Let me come back to Greenwich and give you a statistic. I mentioned it earlier. But between 1850 and 1950, this company, beside the Thames, made not just the pioneering Atlantic telegraph cables, but 82% of all the submarine cables in the world. And that includes the production of what was Siemens Brothers just down the river in Charlton, and they merged in 1935. So they sort of slightly fudged their history and said, we've done this since 1850. They merged because of the recession in the 1930s. There wasn't enough business for the two separate companies. But that building, parts of that building, you see the river at the back. That's the bit that's been redeveloped with flats, but Enderby House is still there somewhere, toward down the river. The building at the front is still there. It is the oldest continuously operating technology production site in the world today. It's on the same site as it's been since 1850, 173 years later. And of course, Southeast London was also key in the invention of optical fibres, and I will come back to that towards the end. Why London? Well, these two places. The Royal Institution on the left, and King's College London on the right, and entrepreneurs. And Royal Institution and King's College, of course, were places where the fundamentals of electromagnetism were discovered, science and technology that were used in electric telegraph and in electric motors and telephones, and all the other things that were developed in that second half or throughout the 19th century that we just take for granted today. It was a bit like, I don't know, Stanford of the day. These guys. It was Humphrey Davy, born in Penzance in 1778. He became a fellow of the Royal Society at the age of 26 when he joined the London Royal Institution. Today, the Society, the average age is in their mid-50s. But he got there when he was 26. Faraday is the other hero of this, born near the Elephant in Newington Butts. Started as Davy's lab assistant at the Royal Institution, and he built a battery in 1812 and went on to describe fundamentals of electricity and magnetism, the things we all learned at A-levels, I think. I did. I can still remember. Wheatstone. You remember Wheatstone Bridges? He's the guy to blame. He went to King's College London, became professor of experimental physics, but his uncle was a musical instrument maker at 436 Strand, which is coincidentally now the site of a threes shop. Although it's part of a new building, but it's still got the number 436. It's part of that bank. A bit of bad publicity a few weeks ago. Coots. He started, when he was at King's College, he started developing work by German scientist Pavel Schilling. It wasn't just a British thing, leading to pioneering electric telegraph. And other person to begin is with William Fothergill Cooke. He wasn't a scientist, but he earned a lot of money in the private army of the East India Company, which ruled not India for profit. He became interested in telegraphy after he retired and came back to London, went into partnership with Wheatstone, with an entrepreneur and a scientist. The first task, as any entrepreneur will know, is identify your customer. So in 1837, who needed the electric telegraph? Oh, the railways, of course. So Cooke and Wheatstone found customers in London with the London and Blackwall Railway, which pioneered the route that's now covered by the Docklands Light Railway, as well as with the London and Birmingham from Euston and the Great Western from Paddington. And this is, of course, the Euston Arch, the gateway to Euston Station. And those chimneys are at a fixed station at Camden, because the last bit. They built it from the Midlands to London, the opposite way to HS2. So they got it right in 1837, but they realised, of course, that the last bit from Camden to Euston was going downhill from Euston, uphill to Camden, and locomotive engines, weren't strong enough to pull a fresh train with all the water and coal uphill. So they had a stationary engine at Camden, which meant they needed some way of telling the engine operator in Camden when to start pulling. Otherwise, you'd start pulling while people were still getting on and off. So the Cook and Wheatstone delivered their telegraph. And the other one was the Great Western, from Paddington to Maidenhead in 1838. And it needed reliable signalling. Brunel was quite a visionary, and there were reports of him driving a train, might have just been an engine and one coach, but at something like 50 or 60 miles an hour from Slough into Paddington in the early days, before it was commercially opened. It was scarily fast for the day, and it meant they needed reliable signalling. And so this was the world's first commercial electric telegraph, opened from Paddington to West Drayton in the first stage on the 9th of April 1839. 185 years ago, getting on. Now that was, if you talk to any Americans, sorry Americans who are listening, they will say Samuel Morse invented the electric telegraph, and the first commercial electric telegraph was this, on the 24th of May 1844. What hath God wrought, he said, in Morse code. That's the bit he did get right. It also went along a railway line from Washington to Baltimore. But Cook and Wheatstone and the GWR beat Morse by 5 years and 6 weeks. So they got there first. They had a rather inelegant system, which was this 5-needle telegraph. You can see several examples in the Science Museum. Morse invented the Morse code. You needed one wire and earth to send a message. Cook and Wheatstone needed 5 wires and earth. They weren't very well insulated, and they didn't work well. Insulation was a big part of the story. Oh, and the other one was Island Gardens. It was then called North Greenwich. It was also a Cook and Wheatstone telegraph because it was a cable-hauled railway. They had the crazy idea that you could just send off cable-hauled trains along the line. You had to tell people when they were coming, you to haul and you to let go. It was a bit like the San Francisco cable car system there, but it was a railway. They abandoned it fairly quickly because it did not really work reliably. But you needed telegraphy to say the next train to Poplar is about to depart. Anyway, let's just recap. In a few years, 5 at the most, between Wheatstone starting work in telegraphy at King's College London and the first commercial applications, and by any standards that's fast development. And there was more to come. Cook in 1846 set up the telegraph company, and that quickly spread across the country. It allowed companies and governments and individuals to send commercial and political and private messages. And that extended, you see the top right picture, across Europe and then across the world, and certainly across the British interests of the world, through Europe, into India, through Malaysia, as we now call it, and then there's a gap of some sea, and they had to address that problem. And of course, there would be another gap across, going westwards from the British Isles to North America, as you will know. When you build your network along roads and railways, it's fairly dry, but it's a problem when you've got sea in the way. So if you run a cable underwater, you need some means of insulation. And the answer is this, which is the leaf of the gutta percha tree, and that's a plantation on the right in Malaysia. Malaya, it would have been called then, and the original caption to that picture was natives harvesting gutta percha, rather than just Malaysians harvesting gutta percha. Like rubber, it produces a sap. Unlike rubber, it crystallizes into a very hard material. Malaysians used it as a material from ancient times. John Tradescant brought it to Europe in 1656, so it had been known about for 200 years. It softens when immersed in hot water, and then it hardens again and it's waterproof and an electrical insulator, which made it perfect for telegraphy. It had other uses before then, before telegraphy. It was used for hose pipes and speaking tubes. You could get a railway conversation tube, so you could talk to the person sitting opposite you without the rest of the compartment hearing. And this is the medical man's midnight friend. So if you were a patient down the bottom or a relative of a patient, you press your button at the door, ring the doorbell, and then you could talk to the doctor at the top in bed without him having to get up and go downstairs to say what's the problem. So the speaking tube from the front. And the gutta percha company was actually quite big and quite wealthy. I used to have a gutta percha in one of my teeth, replacing the middle of an infected root. You can still get jewellery, and I bought some not long ago, made of gutta percha. It's very hard. It looks like the black mineral jet that comes from the Whitby area, but it's of course plastic. They had a big shop, an office in Brent Street, and this is the original building. It's obviously closed now, but that is a big building that would have been thriving in the middle of the 19th century. But they had two places for production, one in Silvertown in North Woolwich, and one in Wharf Road along the Regent's Canal. And this is their premises by the Regent's Canal, and there's the Canal Basin. The Regent's Canal is the north end of that map, and there are two basins which go south: City Road Basin and Wenlock Basin. And they're still there. You can walk up and down the roads. A lot of it it's now flats. It's almost all flats. Almost everything in London that used to be something significant in technology is now flats, including the buildings where they developed stereo in Hayes for EMI and television and all that sort of stuff. It's all flats now. Nobody makes anything in London or invents anything in London, I sometimes think, in my cynical moments. There are lots of flats, though. Expensive flats. The Electric Telegraph Company's first project was to connect London with Birmingham, given their history from that line from London to Camden to control the fixed engine. Mostly their wires were suspended from poles, but sometimes they needed insulation. It's a bit wet between here and Birmingham. Tacks, they tried. Wax, they tried. Pitch, they tried. They didn't work reliably enough. And Michael Faraday suggested gutta percha. And the people who took him up on that were the Siemens Brothers, one was Werner von Siemens, who actually thought of the idea. The other was Wilhelm Siemens, as he started out, but then he came to Britain and set up a factory in Charlton, and then became Sir William Siemens. Mm-hmm. And they had another brother, Karl Heinrich, who went to St. Petersburg to set up a Russian operation. There's the factory, which is still there. The northern bit, which is coloured red, the oldest bit dates to 1863. The developing it still into the 1950s, green bits along the Woolwich Road. On the right, on the east side of that map, right bit is the site of the Woolwich Dockyard, which of course for security reasons was never shown on the map. And beyond that, further east was the Woolwich Arsenal, which also was never shown on the map. Absolutely great giveaway. What's the secret area on the map? Show. What's the name? Applied until the 70s. Things like I grew up in Doncaster near Fylingdales, which is one of the two bomber stations. That you could tell where it was because it wasn't shown on the map. And then the later editions of the Ordnance Survey map did show them. So he said, "Oh yes, it's now there. That must be where it was." And of course, I knew where it was because they did open days. Before then, so on the 10th of January 1859, the UK operation of Siemens Brothers worked with the South Eastern Railway to lay 2 miles of gutta percha insulated telegraph wire from a ship in the Channel, and they successfully sent messages to London. And this was an experiment which lasted a little bit, but they weren't still very good on insulation. But by 1850, they laid a cable across the Channel to Calais. That survived only a few hours before the insulation gave way. They tried again in 1851. From then on, Dover and Calais have been connected by telegraph, as they still are. And the later cables that go down the Channel Tunnel, they're really secure, run by Colt, based just around the corner from here. But Colt has the lease for 25 years, or from a couple of years ago, for the cable access in the central service tunnel of the Channel Tunnel. So, the Gutta Percha company, you know, supplied the insulation, and within the first 2 years, for all those early submarine cable projects, it supplied 1,300 nautical miles of insulation, that's 2,400 kilometers. Next stage, which was one of those unforeseen consequences and benefits of the technology, the astronomer Royal, George Erith, must have had an interesting drink with the South Eastern Railway. They did realise that you could send signals from Greenwich, which of course was the national timekeeper and had been for nearly 200 years, set up to regulate time, to investigate time. But he realised you could send time signals along the Electric Telegraph Company's signals, wires, along the South Eastern Railway's line, from Lewisham Station, which is the one at the bottom left, into central London. And they went to London Bridge, and then the Electric Telegraph Company took it across the bridge into the city, and it meant that the standard time would be set up across the city for banks and then onto different railway companies. So by the early 1850s, we had standard time separate from any government legislation. This was 4 decades before GMT was established as the official time for Britain and Ireland, and longer than that before it was the basis of all time zones in the world. The Southeastern worked with the observatory. They ran a cable through the park, through Greenwich Park, down the hill to Lewisham Station, and then within weeks it was distributing Greenwich time to Blackheath, which is where I live, to Ashford, Folkestone, Dover, Woolwich, Erith, Gravesend, Redhill and Strood. It's one of those unintended consequences of telecoms developments, like we get today with gaming, with Spotify. Nobody planning 3G and 4G said, oh, if we do this, we can have Spotify or we can have Netflix. But people that set up Spotify and Netflix realized that they could use the new technology for a new business plan. And that's exactly what happened with time. In fact, the railroads in the US adopted GMT as their basis of their time zone before the US government decided this was the way to go. So without telegraphy from Greenwich across the Atlantic via subsea cables built in Greenwich, that wouldn't have been possible. Now, because of the geography, it was riverside and there were the rope making companies along the river, there was a lot of business making cables. One of them was W.T. Henley, which originally had been in Greenwich, but then moved north Woolwich, and there's still a Henley Road in East 16. It's very derelict now. There's nothing on either side. At least last time I walked on there on a very wet day, there was nothing. But a series of mergers in Greenwich saw the creation of Glass Elliott, which was based at Enderby House, alongside the Gutta Percha Company in Malden Wharf, which is right next door, and the Enderby family, Enderby House, which I showed a picture of earlier, it's named after the Enderby family, which were a family of whalers. Some people prefer not to talk about that. There was a ship called the Samuel Enderby, mentioned in Moby Dick. The Enderby family were whalers, as well as other even more disgusting trades. It was a focal point for the slave trade as well. Deptford and Greenwich were centres of the slave trade, or the ships that ran the slave trade. And there were a lot of big houses in Greenwich and up on the heath, and above Greenwich, which were built by slavers. But, including John Julius Ankerstein, lots of local loyalty in Greenwich. Some people say, no, he wasn't a slaver. But if you look at his biography, he actually got a lot of money from the slave trade, maybe from ships, but also from family connections. But with land-based telegraph cables, Oh yes, let me show you. Envy. There's an Envy land in Antarctica. I nearly forgot. But with land-based telegraph cables covering much of Europe and North America, linking Britain to the mainland of Europe, the next big project was to cross the Atlantic. And that's, of course, a lot more challenging than 20 miles across the English Channel. The financier behind the project was a guy called Cyrus Field. That's him, an American, now commemorated in this rather short street in the new development behind Envy House. Their pioneering cable was 2,500 nautical miles or 12,600 kilometres. I have no idea what a nautical mile is. I mean, it's a very obscure term that few people still use, but nobody else does. Kilometres, let's stick to kilometres. It was built by Glass Elliott in Greenwich, the ancestor of construction maintenance, and a company in Birkenhead. The Greenwich cable was put aboard a British ship, HMS Agamemnon, an American ship, the USS Niagara, took the Birkenhead portion. They met in mid-Atlantic and moved respectively east and west. Unfortunately, in 1857, the cable snapped. So they tried again in 1858. The ships again starting out in mid-Atlantic and heading east and west. A few more breakages, but they were getting a bit better at that. By mid-August, the American ship had reached Trinity Bay in Newfoundland, which is the bottom left of that picture. And the Royal Navy had reached Valencia in Western Ireland. You remember that was still part of the UK, and that's commemorated with this wonderful granite slab there. In fact, I was in touch with somebody who was in Valencia on holiday only a couple of days ago. Trinity Bay was connected by a short stretch of submarine cable to the North American mainland, because it was on Newfoundland, so it's an island. It was right down the east coast, a bit of subsea cable across to the mainland, and then all the way far south to New York and Washington. And that's a map that's in the Library of Congress. And then, as you see on that granite slab, Queen Victoria sent a message to President James Buchanan, who replied, and that's inscribed on that granite plaque. It was nothing very significant, but there we are. But scientists and engineers at the time didn't really understand the complexities of electricity or insulation, so they ran the cable at 2,000 volts. Because they thought it was needed to be that high to get a signal from one end to the other. It was a long way. The cable worked, but not very fast because of capacitance and impedance and all that sort of stuff. It would actually, you could only get about 3 words a minute through the cable. And then within a month, the gutta percha broke down. Cyrus Field was quite a cute businessman, and any bits of cable that were left over that had been pulled up from the Atlantic or not used, he sold them off. Not on eBay, because obviously it was long before eBay, but they were still on sale on eBay last time I looked for this a couple of years ago, $250 of postage for a little bit of, and it was actually seen in a sort of mahogany case with a little statement saying this is a part of the first transatlantic, the 1858 transatlantic cable, signed by Cyrus Field. There was a bit of a hiatus on American operations because there was the Civil War. But the telegraph industry carried on around the world. In 16 years after that first failed attempt, or second failed attempt, I suppose, the London factories produced 1,400 nautical miles, that's 26,000 kilometres, 14,000 nautical miles, 26,000 kilometres of cables, and they went across the North Sea, obviously across the English Channel, the Aegean, the Mediterranean, the Gulf, and the Bay of Bengal. In fact, there was, in the early 1860s, there was 150th, the first cable from London to Mumbai, Bombay as they would have said then, and that was marked the 150th anniversary about 3 years ago. Meanwhile, back here, Glass Elliott merged with a purchase company to create a unified business called Telegraph Construction and Maintenance, a name that lasted until the 1950s, usually abbreviated to Telecom. And Envy House was its headquarters. This is the old boardroom in the restored pub, and I know people in the industry today, now consultants and retired, who went to meetings in that room. It was the head office of the subsea cable company. Of course, it was there, great place, because before there was radio, the way you knew a ship was arriving was by looking out of your window at the river. So you had a great view along the reach up to the point and the peninsula. You could spot when ships were arriving and get your people to pull them in. Top of the agenda for this board was a new attempt at an Atlantic cable. Cyrus Field was back in business as a Telecom needed some more money, and it found an imaginative way to lay 4,500 kilometres of newly designed cable. Obviously, they had to build better insulation, strengthened cable, and there was a network of and you find that part of this new project on the Isle of Dogs, just across the river from Deptford and Greenwich, Millwall Ironworks, and Brunel. That's where he designed and built Great Eastern in the 1850s. That was intended to be the world's largest passenger liner. It was actually the world's largest ship until the end of the 19th century. Intended to run a passenger service to and from Australia. It was a commercial failure. It was a good ship. It was launched down this slope with great difficulty in 1858. As a commercial failure, it needed a new company that owned it, went bust. Daniel Gooch, who was Brunel's engineer on the Great Western, formed a company to buy the Great Eastern from its bankrupt owners. And there's Gooch on the left, and there's the famous picture of Brunel on the right. Those chains, of course, nobody ever identifies where those chains are, but they're those chains that you see stretched out on the Isle of Dogs, and you can go and see that any day. Those are the Great Eastern chains, and there's Brunel in front of them with his cigar. He only lived a few more years after that picture was taken. And they turned it into a cable ship. It was too deep, almost too big to launch on the Isle of Dogs. So it was basically normally homed at Sheerness down the river on the North Kent coast. And the cable had to be delivered by one of these small, looks like a former HMS warship, but it just trundled up and down the river delivering the cable. And the Great Eastern started its life as a cable carrying ship, cable laying ship. 1865, oh there it is, there's the machinery. There's the ship. There's some rather fanciful pictures with whales going around it and things like that. But July 1865, they started from the west of Ireland. Instead of meeting in the middle and going outwards, they went from Ireland right across to North America. But after a week, the cable broke and fell to the bottom, 2,000 fathoms, that's 3.5 kilometres. And the Great Eastern went home to start again a year later, July 1866. This time, a complete cable was landed in Heart's Content, Newfoundland. 14 days it took to cross the Atlantic from Ireland. Cable was connected, and here's the clever bit. The ship then went back to grapple up the cable that was lost the previous year from mid-Atlantic, spliced it to a new cable, and then the Great Eastern did an about turn, continued back to Newfoundland with a second complete connection, which meant that from no cable to 2 working cables across the Atlantic in just a few weeks. And since then, North America and Europe have been connected by the electric telegraph, or its modern equivalent, the phone and the internet, without a break. And this is how they landed the cable. Of course, they couldn't bring a big ship right up to the beach. This is the top left picture is, I think, Cornwall, one of the early pictures from Port Curnow or somewhere like that. The top right picture is the first transatlantic phone cable in the middle of the 1850s. Again, Newfoundland to, I think, northern Scotland. And I can't remember where the bottom left cable is, but the bottom right cable is in 2020, which was the first first telecoms cable to the Cook Islands in the South Pacific, and they were connected by cable for the first time. During the pandemic, it was quite a challenging operation because the person in charge of it, a guy called Ronald Scarborough, who used to work for BT, he ran the fibre up Cornwall, did a great job of Cornwall. last decade, and then went off to various subsea projects, and he's still doing that. That exactly the same technique for more than 100 years. You just drag a few local volunteers, and you probably they just pull the cable up, and they wear high vis these days. In the old days, they flat caps and tweed jackets. Now let's go back down the River Thames to Siemens Brothers. Siemens Brothers, the British arm of Siemens Brothers, was a German-owned company. Of course, it had been set up by them from Germany in the 1860s. 4th of August 1914, World War I broke out. Now the war was declared, the British Post Office, sent one of its own cable ships into the Channel to cut the German subsea cables to America, cutting off Germany from America for the duration of the war. For Siemens in London, it took more than a year to sort out the legal situation. The company was, of course, enemy property. And until January 1916 for it to be put in British hands. So what, 16 months after the war started. After the armistice, the Woolwich Siemens remained a British company. There was a bit of reorganisation. It sold some bits to English Electric, and it reformed an association with Siemens of Germany. It bought a new cable laying ship called Faraday, which you see on the cover of this anniversary history. Times were tough, and in the 1930s it merged with its cable business with Telecoms just up the river in Greenwich. And a new company was formed called Submarine Cables Limited, but most people still called it Telcom. And of course, there were all these factories along the river that made subsea cables, and the Siemens factory also made telephones, it made telephone exchanges, it made lots of other things in the telecoms industry. And this map was a German map showing the targets in Woolwich for the victory, and with Siemens Brothers factories clearly identified. It survived quite well. There was some damage, but most of the factory is still there. Much later, it became AEI, Associated Electrical Industries. It merged, as I said, with Telcom, became Submarine Cables Limited, somehow found its way into AEI. In the late 1960s, AEI was taken over by GC. That's not General Electric of the US, it's GC, a British company was based in Mayfair. No idea where it is now. After that, there's a huge amount of rationalisation and closure and bloodletting. There was a government institution called the Industrial Organisation Corporation, which created ICL out of the computer elements of a lot of these companies. But the electrical and electronic and telecoms bits went to different companies, went to GEC. The Woolwich factory, which had been the biggest employer in South East London after the Arsenal was shut down, at its peak in 1940, employed 9,583 people. In 2010, moving on 50 years, but Alcatel Submarine Networks, Alcatel Submarine Networks became part of Nokia, who still owns it, and the company won a Queen's Award for Industry. And it invited me and other telecoms journalists to visit the factory. They didn't allow photography in the factory, but they did take us on board a ship, the Bats. They're all named after French islands off the coast of Brittany. And it brought it up to Deptford, not to Enderby Wharf. There was no secure place to moor there. There was a plan to build a cruise liner terminal, but that came to nothing, fortunately. This is 2010, the last time ever there was a cable ship in the Thames. It was a French ship, as you see, and it marked the end of 160 years of submarine telegraphy in London. There's the tricolour, and there's another picture of the ship, and it was a big ship, and we went down inside it. We saw them splicing the fibres. They've got a complete factory in there to lay the cables and to mend any breaks. It became part of STC before Telecoms survived the Woolwich closure. Became part of STC, the Telephones and Cables, which was owned by ITT. STC in the UK is a very innovative company, and this is where I come to the last great contribution to telecoms from Southeast London, so far anyway. Enter Charles Cao, born in Shanghai in 1933. He moved to British ruled Hong Kong as a teenager in 1948, when, of course, there was a civil war going on, or just ending in China. He came to Woolwich Poly to take his A-levels and study for a degree in electrical engineering. Here's the guy on the right, a very neat, long coat. And then he would have been about 17 or 18. This is from his own book about his story. We travelled by boat to Southampton with a group of other Hong Kong students coming to study in Britain. And it still happens. I remember flying back from Hong Kong, a few years ago, obviously before the pandemic, after a conference. And it was just before the start of term. It was about late September, early October. And the plane was full of Hong Kong students returning to their universities in London or in Britain. He came on the SS Canton. You didn't really fly from Hong Kong to London in those days. And he lived here at 14 Rochester Road in Plumstead, having got the 53 bus, he says in his book, from central London, from Trafalgar Square. Stayed in Plumstead. He travelled every day on the same bus route back to Woolwich Poly. And Woolwich Poly was this rather decrepit building, which is still there in the centre of Woolwich. And a few of us locals who have been making think about the although Greenwich's rather lamentable handling of his archives, which are now in a whole bunch of cardboard boxes with no access to the public, or virtually no access to the public. It's a rather nice local history library, as most boroughs in London do have their records in local history libraries. Greenwich decides it doesn't need it, and it's got them in cardboard boxes, and we've suggested the old Poly building would be a good place. It's also above water level, even very good work, which is important if you're looking after paper records. Anyway, Charles Cao graduated from Woolwich Poly, then joined STC. Oh, that's what it is now. Of course, it's in the old Royal Naval College, a rather fancy building. And he joined STC and did a PhD at UCL as an external student. And he went across the river to North Woolwich through the foot tunnel from Woolwich Poly to work in one of their subsea cable factories. The factory isn't there, but there is a standard trading estate, standard industrial estate in North Woolwich, which is on the same site, and it obviously borrows the name from Standard Telephones and Cables. He meanwhile married Gwen, a British-born engineer with STC, living in Blackheath, which is where I live, by coincidence. They were married in 1959 at St John's Church, that's that one shown on that picture, having previously been turned away from another Anglican church in Blackheath. And I assume that's All Saints, which is the one in the middle of the heath that you see if you go across the A2. What's the heath on the A2? And I assume that's All Saints. But the vicar, according to his book, told them he didn't marry foreigners. Neither one of them was British and the other was from Hong Kong. But there we are. He was alive and thriving then, still around, of course. He then moved out of London with his PhD to Harlow to join STC's laboratory, STL, R&D Centre, and one of the world's leading telecoms labs. He's no longer. He joined George Hockham, and they invented optical fibres. There's him on his bench. That's the cover of the book, his memoir. He invented with Hockham optical fibres, and he got the Nobel Prize for Physics in 2009 and was knighted the following year. Sadly, he didn't deliver his Nobel speech because he'd already got advanced Alzheimer's by the time he got the Nobel. Gwen spoke for him. He died in 2018 in California, where they moved to be close to their kids. And Gwen still chairs, and I checked a couple of days ago, still chairs the Hong Kong-based Charles K. Cao Foundation for Alzheimer's Disease. Meanwhile, what happened to Henry Wolff? as I said earlier, it's still a factory on the site. Makes optical fibre repeaters, which amplify the light signals on long-haul routes. Telecom, as I said, had become STC, bought by Alcatel, French company. That became Alcatel Lucent in that fabled and ludicrous merger of equals, as the French and the Americans behind it called it. And they got bought by Nokia. It was a disastrous merger, and Nokia took it on. It tried to sell the submarine cable business. This was an open secret. It was quite a few years ago now. I don't know if it's still on the market privately. There are only two real Western subsea cable manufacturers, one in the States and one in France and Britain. And then there are one in Japan and one in China, and that's about it. It's a very small market, even though there's a big upsurge in the number of subsea cable orders. Because most of the subsea cables that were laid now, that are in operation now, were laid in about 2000. And our demand for data access is huge. 23 years, it's gone up right up through the ceiling. And there were, for example, lots of islands in the Caribbean that said, "Oh wow, we've got broadband internet access in the year 2001." But basically, they got a very small fibre that joins them, and only one fibre. As we found out about 4 years ago now, Tonga in the South Pacific, there was a big subsea volcano. It broke their cable, not only the cable that came from Fiji, and the cable that ran up to their offshore islands from the main Fiji island, from the main Tonga island. It took about 4 or 5 months before it was repaired. They had to send a repair ship. The industry has repair ships all over the world. And the nearest one was in Indonesia. They had to send it to pick up the right sort of cable, then find the break, and it was a long break. It wasn't just a cut that you get with anchors and things like that, cutting cables. It was several miles long, and they had to replace it, and then they worked on the cable along the islands. Till then, they had to rely on satellites, which gives a lot of latency in the communications. If you've ever done a phone call over satellite, you will know what I mean. It's not very good for modern computer communications, because that latency tends to screw up all sorts of criticals. Anyway, but back to, as I said, the cable manufacturer went to Calais and then first to Southampton to Calais, which is where it is now. The company sold most of the space to property developers. That's one of the enormous flats. If you compare that with the low-rise buildings, that fairly horrible 50s low-rise buildings, but they're about 10 stories. They are enormous. But there on the left of that picture, you see Enderby House as the pub. As I said, a decade ago, a group of us were concerned about its state, and about the fact a few years ago it had no security, the hoardings, as you see there. It would have been easy for an arsonist, for fun, of course, to break in on a weekend, which would have magically released that site for development. It didn't happen. We had to persuade the developers that it would be a good site for a pub, to be converted into a pub, to be modernised and extended. We hoped at the time that they would put some significance, show what the significance of the house was, but they haven't. But they have nevertheless got, you can eat there, part of Young's, and one of the things that we did do, Dan and I and other people, we said, look, this is one of the homes of the telecoms industry. This is one of the homes of the connected world. You need to actually pay tribute to what happened here. And so we suggested, we gave them a list of potential names. So now there's a Telecom Way. There's Morse Lodge, that's Cable Walk. There's Southfield Street, even though, he was a financier, he wasn't based in Greenwich. And there's Telegraph Avenue, the official address of Enderby House is Telegraph Avenue. So it's suddenly, after all those years, there is a lot of street names. Oh, and there's even this bag shed called Samuel Enderby. He was a whaler, we're talking about him. And that's where all the men and women of South East London used to make high-tech telecoms cables and equipment. And some of them still do, in the repeater factory, that's what's left. So if you head down to the Enderby House pub by the river on a rather better day than today, it's got a group of us locals quietly campaigned for its survival. And the fact that seeing that Enderby House is in Telegraph Avenue is because we planted the idea in their brains 10 years ago. So there you go.
Now, if anyone has any questions out in Zoom land, if they could put them into chat, and we'll be able to pick them up, I hope, if I can get this to show chat rather than showing.
Yes.
Yeah, this is all terribly complicated.
You need an IT person to sort it out.
Well, as I was saying over lunch, the real problem is that we now have to become users.
Yes.
We all know what we thought of users.
Yep.
And now I seem to have lost the cursor, which is
It's on
On the right hand side.
the man chewing.
It's on that straight.
Chat.
Right. See if we can get this to work and show what chat is saying.
Quite a few there.
Yes.
Oh, great. Yeah, that's all good. Right, now how the hell do I do this? Fine, so. Oh, you're recording my mistakes again. Thank you. There's a question from Brian. You mentioned Woolwich Polytechnic. Was this the same as Thames Poly?
Yes, it was. It became Thames Poly, and all the polys were created in the 70s. Certainly by the time I worked in Woolwich in 1973, it was Thames Poly, but it also had a place in Hammersmith, I think, which then they got split off and became different institutions. And then Thames Poly, about a decade ago, became Greenwich University and moved out to Woolwich. And it's now the electronics and clever stuff is on the Medway somewhere. And the other stuff is in Greenwich in the old Royal Naval College.
Yes, Bill Burns said there's a description of fact
Very much
on
so.
the wall.
Oh, thank you. Hello, Bill.
I think Bill is probably our furthest visitor today because he's somewhere in the States.
He's in New York.
I don't know if anyone else is dialing in around the world. Yes, we did set up a set of brief descriptions with QR codes on the sculpture pieces to try and explain what they represented. So
I don't know where they go. Where
they go to a website which was part of the old Enderby House.
Oh, right, so it's ours. Right.
Well, it's mine because I pay for it. But
Yes, I know. I started it and you took it over. Yeah.
it's all very complicated. Let me do that. Oh yes, somebody has said yes. Nautical mile is just over 2,025 yards.
Yep.
So that needs a little bit of.
It was 1760.
There's another popular question there. What is the distance between the equator and the North Pole via Paris in meters? And it's precisely 40,000 meters.
It's exact, isn't it? That's the definition of meter.
Yeah.
Very Babylonian.
Yeah. Oh, very French revolutionary. The new Leo constellations, yes, have significantly lower latency. Yes, they're about 750 to 1,200 kilometers above the Earth. So, the ping time between here and a Leo satellite, if it's going overhead, they're nearer than, say, Frankfurt data center complex or something like that. So they are very, very close. It depends where the Earth station is that picks up the signal from the Leo and then connects it into the network to the data center. Is fast. Whereas, of course, a geostationary satellite is a quarter of a second, a third of a second. And by the time you get a couple of hops, I remember talking to somebody at Mobile World Congress Exhibition Conference in Barcelona, and because he had a Kenyan number, because he ran then from Kenya, I think it was, but it went all the way to Kenya and then back via several satellite hops. So it basically waiting for about 3 seconds to hear his reply, even though he was literally about 20 meters out of the room that I was in.
Yes, if you look at atlanticcable.com, that's Bill Burns's website about the history of the Atlantic cable.
It's more than that. It's the history of all submarine
Well,
communications. He started off with the Atlantic cable.
Yeah.
Yes.
I got sidetracked like we all do.
It's a really good resource. Yeah.
Oh, Woolwich Poly leased its first computer, the Stantec Zebra, which we have had a lecture. Given to
Stantec as in Standard Telecommunications and Cables, right? Yeah. So the local company.
That lecture's passed away now. Don Hunter.
Dan, could I pose a question?
Yeah. I have a question from the.
Alan, thank you very much. You're a journalist.
Yes.
How difficult was it to piece together the story? How much digging did you have to do outside the established canon of this history?
It's been a sort of enthusiasm of mine for a long time, partly fortuitously, because I live in Bradley and it's just down the road from me, and before we were married, my wife lived in Queenshill in Greenwich, so we used to walk along the riverside path, past all these factories when they were there, and Glyas, of which Dan Hayton, the Great London Industrial Archaeology Society, used to do boat trips in the early 80s along the river, and that's where some of my pictures came from a Glyas boat trip, which went down through the then still brand new Thames Barrier. So I've been putting it together over years and years, and dug out, a lot of records of where things are, and some of it is just foot slogging, is looking at records. Trouble is, the archives often are gone because these companies were involved in so many mergers, and certainly I think most of the Siemens Brothers archives in Woolwich, GC was not ever a good company for looking after its records, and I think they just got thrown in a skip. And there's certainly stories about other records from other companies that were rescued from skips. In fact, yesterday afternoon, in the pouring rain, I'd got a call from somebody who lives in Greenwich, elsewhere in Greenwich, who'd rescued a whole bunch of large-scale maps of the area, including the old Alcatel site, current Alcatel site, Telecoms site, 1250. So, each map is about that size, so there's about 30 or 40 of them. So I went to pick them up from her. Friend had found them in the skip. I said, "Do you want these?" Well, I found a home for it. So it's now, I'm looking after it now.
Somebody did find in a skip at Enderby, when they were clearing out the general layout for converting the Great Eastern into a cable ship.
Oh, brilliant.
And it was in the skip.
Yes, of course.
Fortunately, they took it out of the skip.
Where is it now?
I'm not sure.
I think the Naval
This is what,
Museum has got a lot of stuff, but I'm not sure.
there's a sort of tendency, particularly in industrial archaeology, which Alan and I have done, interested in, for what's known as private preservation.
Yes.
And it's everything from small pieces of scientific instruments to cast iron plaques with street names.
Oscilloscopes.
Oscilloscopes, all sorts of things end up in people's private.
TMC in Dulwich, says Bob. Yes, that was there for a long time, and I actually went to see it in the late 70s, I think. Oh, right, yes, I didn't know they had a place in Canterbury. But yes, TMC,
Bob would know about Canterbury, of course.
the building is still there. It's now sort of serviced offices and offices for creative industries, tucked away. I remember going, as I say, in the 70s. I don't remember what I went to see. This was just before one of the big Telecoms exhibitions in Geneva. So it must have been, Telecom 79. And I remember going to talk to them, but I can't remember what it was.
It was quite interesting, actually. When I was approached about TMC, it was a guy whose mother used to work for them back in about 1968. Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And he approached me via the BCS because he was trying to track things down. And the BCS said, "Oh, we'll ask Bob because it's BCS Kent." And he got it wrong, and he actually said TCM, which sent me off on a bit of a wild goose chase, because of course TCM stands for something too. Um, and he'd also got the wrong road completely, the wrong side of Canterbury. But we did actually track down the precise building, which is actually, and it backs onto something called Roper Close, which anyone in Canterbury might know.
The address, and I will go and look at it next
Yeah,
time.
it is St Dunstan Street. Is the I can send it through to you if you email me. My
Yes.
email address is on the screen. And it was she worked there for some years, and when you look around at Roper Close, which is actually a completely different place, it actually backs onto this, and that was the entrance the workers went into. And I've spoken to somebody who knew a bus conductor who went past it every day, and it said TCM on it, and so on. They also had a place in Medway Town somewhere. So I think I had 4 places, but the Dulwich one was a big one.
And the Pi Group, which was based in Cambridge, bought them in the mid-70s, I think.
A bit earlier than that, and then it was Philips, I think.
And Philips bought it and destroyed it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
It's almost nothing. There's a very good website run by the old Pi.
Yeah. I used that in my research. Yes.
Which is part of the Cambridge Technology Museum, which is only open Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or something like that. Just Friday, Saturday, Sunday. But it's quite a good museum with a lot. They had a big exhibition on Pi a few months ago.
But I'm interested to hear, having heard you today, that I thought, well, why Dulwich? But now I can see why. Everyone else was there.
Yes, yeah. I mean, it's a residential area, so it's not an obvious place. But there were lots of high-tech places, including factories, all the way around London. You know, Dollis Hill. When I was up there, well, you know, people were there. Why Hayes? You know, Hayes was an amazing place in West London that developed the brain scanner. You know, Geoffrey Hounsfield got the Nobel for the brain scanner in Hayes. It was where electronic television was invented. It's where stereo recording was invented by Alan Dower Bloomline. I mean, it's an amazing place, and now it's just lots and lots of bloody flats. Nobody gets employed by high tech there anymore.
Yeah.
A question there about the cable from Paddington to West Drayton. Would it have had some form of amplification, or would it just?
I think it was just copper, which is why the only application was basically like the old semaphore telegraphs. You've got them into one place, and some poor guy then clicked it out on a new Morse key.
Yes, because there's a next question: did the semaphore?
Yes.
Optical semaphores have telescopes? Yes, they did, and they had. As I said, there were various ways of doing it. What's interesting is that if you go to Père Lachaise Cemetery, is where Shap is buried.
What was he? Right, okay.
And apparently, the little bronze of one of his stations above it, there was a particular set of angles that said "at rest" when there was no message coming in.
Yes.
And on top of it,
yes.
that signal is displayed. I'm not sure whether that's really true or not, because I don't speak Shap.
No, and nobody does anymore. Yes, so the limiting factor, but that's why it was impressive that they managed to do it from Paris to Strasbourg in 15 minutes. I mean, you have to question that slightly, because there was no standard time in sort of the end after Waterloo. Well, you do a ping, don't you? You send it out and you send it back, and you see how long. Yeah. Oh, you went to
school at the top of Telegraph.
Yeah. Is that Haberdashers? I can't lie. Well, my cousins went to Haberdashers at the top of Telegraph. Yeah. And the 53 to Thames College using the computer. Yeah. Right. Yes. Exactly.
Cable and wireless, of course.
I didn't mention cable and wireless.
Mention the magic name, but of course, one of the past presidents of the New Commons Society, his great-great-great-great-grandfather was one of the founders.
Oh, right. Okay. What was that?
E.F. Clark.
And of course, the old headquarters here of Cable and Wireless, it was the Imperial Telegraph Company, I can't remember its previous name, is in Moorgate.
Yes, and it has nice sculpture outside.
Yeah, and on the roof. Yeah.
If you could ever see it for the hoardings while they convert it into flats.
Yes. Yeah. It was a poly or was the university for some time. I don't know. I went there.
I don't really know what's happening.
Cable and Wireless, based in Porthcurno. Well, it had its main operations in Porthcurno, Bill, but I don't know. Yeah. I mean, Red Round Square was where I used to go to talk to Cable and Wireless. Oh, is it the side? Okay, fine, thank you. I will go and have a look at it.
Brian was there at the unveiling.
Ah, lovely. Good.
Well, because the Scottish lock where the cable failed when it was flattened by a submarine.
Right, well,
They've actually had lots of instances recently with not even subsea earthquakes and volcanoes. They've simply had slippage from very heavy rainfall washing into the deltas of rivers.
yes, there was one.
There was one in Africa.
Yes, just out off the few hundred kilometres off the mouth of the Congo, and there was just so much stuff coming down the river that it just swamped all the cables. And of course, cable cuts are always people start being suspicious about cable cuts. There was one just off the Egyptian coast, just off Alexandria, about 10 years ago, when a whole lot of cables went one after the other. And the simple explanation is that it was just an idiot ship, an idiot captain dragging their anchor along the coast and just cutting the cables, which would have done. But then people always say, "Oh, was it sabotage?" Well, it might have been. It might have been testing the reaction. And of course, the Navy, always looking for another few million quid to do something else, it always keeps planting the story that our subsea cables are vulnerable around the UK. And all I will say is look at Telegeography's submarinecablemap.com, which shows dozens and dozens of cables. So if somebody started working from Aberdeenshire southwards, cutting all the cables, it would take them a few days just to get to Dover, and somebody would notice. The RAF would be out there within a few minutes because people would notice. And that's ignoring all the cables going across the channel and across to the west. And of course the fact that some of the biggest and most important cables are the Channel Tunnel. So impervious to anchors.
One of the points is, of course, about the fact that it's the internet.
Yes.
Before they invented the World Wide Web, when we first got onto the internet, friends of ours who lived not a nautical mile away from us,
Yes.
and could have probably have shouted the message. It took about 4 days going back and forth across the Atlantic, trying to get from their ISP into mine to deliver the message. And you could follow this, if you unpicked the route on the front of the message.
I remember when I got Windows 95, and my first sort of email account was CompuServe, and CompuServe, yes, and everything went via the eastern seaboard of the US.
Waco.
Huh?
I had a feeling it was Waco at one point. Yeah.
Was it Waco? It was even further away. Oh wow! Yeah.
Mr. Rees, may I offer a comment rather than a question? You mentioned Humphrey Davy and Michael Faraday, who were the first chairman and secretary of the Athenaeum Club, which I remember.
I didn't know that.
And the founder and driving force behind the foundation of the club was a man called John Wilson Croker, who was Secretary of the Navy, and an MP, and an expert on the French Revolution. Incredible energy.
Yeah.
And he ran everything to do with the Navy except the strategy. He left that to the admirals. And he set up the communications down to the Channel ports, so that if there were an attack from France, then we'd know about it pretty damn fast.
Yes, right. Was that semaphore communications, or did they have?
I think it was a chain. I think it was a chain of hill
Yes, yeah. So it's the semaphore.
Yes.
Yeah.
This would have been
They sort of rethought it. They tore them all down. in the beginning of the 19th century before Waterloo, and then they sort of put them back up again a bit later because they realised it was quite good to be able to communicate with your ships in harbour fairly quickly. Yeah.
It's interesting. I remember being interviewed many years ago for Radio 4
Oh yeah.
about the history of communications in general. And one of the points that was brought up was the fact that whatever happens in the communications movement, chances are that the military are going to be the people who will buy it.
Yeah.
From the fact that Roman roads were not there for commerce or anything else, they were there to transmit military information quickly and efficiently.
And Haussmann's boulevards in Paris.
Yeah, all sorts of ideas. The other thing was that the suggestion was that the only possible customer for Marconi and his newfangled radio was the British Admiralty.
Yeah.
Because everyone else had a small navy and they could wave at each other. But with a blue ocean fleet, the British Navy had to be able to communicate over the horizon.
I had 8 or 9 years ago, I think it was, maybe longer. Joan and I, my wife Joan and I, were on holiday in Bologna, and before then I wrote to the Marconi Museum, which is just south of Bologna. And of course, Bologna is one of the oldest universities in the world. But I contacted them and said, could we come and have a look around the Marconi Museum in Villa Grifoni, in the middle of the countryside, about 10, 12 kilometers outside Bologna. And there is Marconi's family home with reconstruction of this equipment, but they've also collected lots of other stuff from the age of radio, including an original Marconi wireless station as would have been on a ship like the Titanic in the beginning of the century. And the thing, I did electronics at university, I followed the history of radio and wireless and all that sort of thing. The thing I didn't know about the coherer and the Marconi radio station is the bloody noise it makes. Because you've got the thing shaking the iron pilings the whole time. You uncohere it so you can get it to work again. And it's deafening. It is, these days would be illegal because it would be so loud. You'd have to have ear protectors. And then they switched it on, and because they're in the middle of the countryside and they've probably got permission from the Italian regulator, they can send whatever sort of electrical noise over the countryside that they want. And of course, it was not a precise frequency. It was right across all the spectrum. And the other things they've got is, if you remember sort of 1940s, 50s war films, when the American GIs would have those things that looked like giant Motorola mobile phones, but about 10 times the size with valves in them. And they also had a Wehrmacht radio station. And so we talked across from an American GI handheld radio to a Wehrmacht radio in the same room. It was totally unencrypted. Yeah. It was just on some sort of, shortwave frequency, 50 meters or something like that.
Yes. Yeah. One of the jobs that was offered to my father during the Second World War was to go out and sit in the channel and listen to E-boat RT and report back what was happening. Well, being a wireless operator, he realised that as soon as he started tapping, they would know exactly where to. So he wasn't having that, so he took the other option, which was to go to SOAS and be taught Japanese.
Well, that seems quite much safer. At least it worked out much safer.
Well, except for the fact they were sending over V2s at the time and things like that.
Oh, yes. Where was SOAS moved out of London, or was it still in
No,
London?
he was in London.
Right. Wow.
Oh, they didn't send the military out of London. Together. Anyway.
A few months ago, I came across an article on a website called London Reconnections. And the article was about some sort of telegraph hub at the post office near St Paul's.
Yes.
And this was extended. The messages came through and were printed out on paper. And this was then extended to Whitehall and to various government departments and to banks and so on, using a system of vacuum tubes, the sort of thing you used to find.
Really?
Sort of thing you used to find in department stores, but not much.
And in Paris had a network of.
It's carried on apparently until the early 50s.
Okay.
surprising.
Pneumatic tubes, weren't they?
Pneumatic.
Yeah, yeah. The post office had a pneumatic railway, rather like the post office railway we know today, which is shorter, but it came, sort of into the city from the west. And the problem was it went through the Fleet Valley. So every so often the mail would turn up rather damp.
The other problem was that they had leather seals to keep the vacuum, and the rats loved those.
Yes.
It was a problem with the Brunel.
Yes.
The old Central Telegraph Office, which was bombed in World War II, then that site became headquarters of BT in the 70s, and BT moved out about 5 or 6 years ago to a building I'm going to be seeing later on today, because they've got an exhibition of telephone exchanges in the new BT headquarters. But whenever I get one of those spoof calls saying, "Oh, hello, this is BT OpenReach, we're calling about your internet connection. Are you the person that looks after the internet connection in your house?" And I say, "Well, where are you calling from?" And they say, "Well, BT." And I say, "Well, office of BT." And they say, "Oh, it's 61 Newgate Street." And I said, "Oh, that's the building that BT knocked down a few years ago, isn't it?" At which point they say, "Oh shit," and put the phone down.
That's a somewhat different topic, really, but at the moment there's a lot of discussion about the use of copper and resources and the electrification of the planet. I mean, Radio 4 has the book of the week on the subject. And then
That's right, yeah.
I was looking at City News the other day, and they said you need 45 megatons of copper for 1 megawatt of electricity. And I'm hoping they mean 45 tons, not 45 megatons. But I was just wondering, with regard to the wind farms at sea, they must need these long, powerful submarine cables. And if there was any crossover between the submarine communications cables and the submarine.
Oh yeah, it's the same industries, the same companies with the same skills of putting cables at the bottom of the sea. So a lot of the companies like, I can't even think of them. It's not the telecoms, the companies that lay telecoms cables, the companies that make the cable, Pirelli, for example, who build the cables, they also do power cables, yes. And there is a sort of shared industry. Regular email newsletter, and that covers everything from the power industry to the subsea as well. Because basically, you've got to put these things at the bottom of the sea and make sure nobody damages them. So what you do in shallow waters, usually these days, is put them in trenches, which makes it much more expensive. Yeah, so you have to dig a trench remotely, with some sort of robot digger, and then cover it over. And certainly they do it at shore ends before they land them. But certainly for heavy shipping like the sea on the Channel and Eastern China, the seas around Eastern China, are very vulnerable to shipping, so they tend to bury them.
Because it must be very high voltage and very high current.
Yeah. Well, even subsea cables, you need power. You need DC power to deliver to power the amplifier, and that's about 1500 volts. So
Interesting, because what I remember of my A-level physics.
yes, sir. I'm slightly longer ago than my A-level physics.
Well, but of course AC was much better for transmitting current than DC. For some reason, I forget if anyone ever explained the reason. But of course, nowadays, with offshore wind farms, you're using high voltage DC to bring the current into the shore station.
The benefit of DC is that the peak voltage is lower, because in AC you get root to the higher voltage.
See, he remembers his A-level physics.
So you've got to build the insulation to much thicker standards.
Oh, somebody noted that there's one of the semaphore towers that could be seen.
Yes.
Near Wisley.
Yes. And so you can go and stay there. And it was an open day, but I was away on holiday earlier this summer, or last summer, because we're not summer and advertising.
I assume that Telegraph Hill was
absolutely, yeah. All the Telegraph Hills had semaphore stations, obviously.
Well, what Eustace has.
Any more questions from the floor? Nothing else on chat. So could I ask Dolan to give the vote of thanks?
Alan, thank you for that charming and unusual narrative. And thank you for constructing it. And all the excavation that must have gone into that.
That's what I've been doing for 50 years. I've been a journalist, so digging out stuff is what I do. Yeah.
But it's a narrative that links local history, which usually flies under the radar of canonical history or the broad scale history, into global history. And I look forward in 50 to 100 years, from wherever I may be at that time, to the narratives we would construct then about the contribution we're currently making to global history.
Indeed.
And I think you can tell by the range, the variety and enthusiasm of the questions, both from that line and from the floor, of just how much that was appreciated.
Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.